Hello there, and welcome to this special edition of Cloud with Chris. You're with me, Chris Reddington, and here we normally talk about all things cloud. But today we're going to be talking about cloud, of course. We're going to be talking about Azure as part of Global Azure 2021. So welcome if you're new to the channel, and thank you for tuning in. And of course, to anyone who's been around on the channel for a while, hello and welcome back. So with that quick introduction, what we're going to do here is we're going to jump across to the screen share and jump into today's topic here. So there we go. We will be talking today all about using Hugo, Azure Storage, Azure CDN for a cheap and performant website using Azure. So welcome to this talk once again as part of Global Azure 2021. Now, as I mentioned, this is part of the Global Azure 2021 virtual conference that is going on. So please go ahead and, as an attendee, go and claim your learner badge. I'll leave the QR code on screen there for you, so you can go ahead and claim that. There's also some additional information about 30 days to learn from the Global Azure team, as well as a virtual background and another badge if you wish as well. So even in these virtual conference times, we still have the swag, which we all love as part of going to conferences. So for those of you who are new to the channel and don't know me, my name is Chris Reddington. I, by day, am a cloud solution architect at Microsoft, and by night, one of the things that I really enjoy doing in my spare time is blogging, podcasting, vlogging, that sort of work, and really adding value to the community. You know, that's really why I enjoy doing this type of work and sharing back to the community. So one of the things I also do is I'm a co-organizer of a local meetup group, Azure Thames Valley, and as I say, I do a lot of podcasting, etc. in my spare time. So one of the things that I am is a host of my own channel, Cloud with Chris, that you're actually listening and watching to today for this Global Azure conference. So with that, if you like this episode, or this presentation, I should say, I actually make a lot of other content related to this, and you can see that on screen. www.cloudwithchris.com is my website. You're watching through my YouTube channel, Cloud with Chris, but of course as well available on Twitter at RedObowen. So again, if you like the content and you want to follow and find out more content similar to what we'll be talking about today, please go ahead and check out those various social profiles, as that is very much appreciated. And again, if you are based in the UK, or it really doesn't matter where you are based at the moment, I suppose. I mentioned a moment ago that I am also part of a local meetup group, and I'm one of the organizers there, Azure Thames Valley. So again, we have a presence online, azurethamesvalley.com, also meetup.com/azure-thames-valley. You can go ahead and find some of the latest and greatest that we've got going on there, and we have a lot coming up actually. We have some great speakers lined up, so please do go ahead, check that out, and we keep that up to date every month or so. So with that, for today's session, we are going to be talking all about Hugo, static site generators, Azure Storage, Azure CDN. So for anyone watching live, would love to know, please feel free to voice in the chat there and put your comments in as we go. More than happy to answer questions as we go along, and I'll do my best to keep an eye on the chat window as we go. But I'd love to understand, is this something you've already done before? Are you familiar with these static site generators? Have you used a lot of Azure Storage in the past and Azure CDN? Let me know in the chat, just so I know what the level is of the audience, and I can make sure I'm working appropriately and giving the right concepts here. So with that, let's just introduce what this talk is going to give you and how we're going to be outlining this talk here today. So first off, we'll be covering a pattern known as the static content hosting pattern. And this is one of these cloud design patterns that actually is available and exists. There's sometimes this perception that cloud design patterns don't really exist. And, some people ask me, are there such patterns defined? Yes, there are. And we will be talking about one of those today. And we'll actually be talking about how it relates to a concept called Jamstack as well. And Jamstack, I won't reveal just yet what it is. We will talk about it a bit later, but it very closely ties to this static content hosting pattern that we will once again be talking about. And then what we'll be digging into is how static site generators relate to that. And overall then, the idea is in the clue of the name of the conference here, Global Azure. How can we go ahead and then host these types of services and workloads on Azure? So we'll be talking about things like Azure Storage, Azure CDN, and Azure Static Websites as well. So again, if you're watching live, brilliant, welcome, thank you for joining, and please do go ahead and drop any comments in the chat window as we go. More than happy to steer off course as we need to answer any questions as we go. So first off then, let's just make sure we're all speaking the same language here and understanding some of these core concepts. So the static content hosting pattern. So if you're not familiar already, there is a website in the Azure docs called the Azure Architecture Center. It's a brilliant, brilliant hub for information related to cloud design patterns, Azure reference architectures, anti-patterns, the well-architected framework, the cloud adoption framework, many, many different great tools as a cloud solution architect that you might want to have in your kit bag as you go along and start building and implementing and designing. Now, one of these patterns that exists in the Azure Architecture Center is this static content hosting pattern. And what it is effectively is a way for you to go ahead and take those static assets like HTML files, CSS files, images, JavaScript, maybe MP3s or videos, those types of files that are not dynamic in nature, they don't change. And rather than hosting them on some kind of expensive underlying compute, like Kubernetes or virtual machines or app service or something similar, you can go ahead and store it in something which is a lot cheaper. So store it in something like Azure Storage, for example. So therefore, you get some cost benefits of hosting it there. You don't need to waste the cycles on your, premium compute, if you like, on retrieving files and the like. So it's a way of you offloading some of these expensive compute cycles to another location. And this is effectively the static content hosting pattern. And because of that, because we're talking about static content, it's very common then to have a content delivery network in front of that then as well, or a CDN as it's sometimes known. And again, we'll be covering that a little bit later, what they are, why you might consider using them as well. So let's take stock a moment. We could use this pattern, for example, if we've got some assets, for example, on our website that are static in nature. So maybe we're not going to put the whole site into Azure Storage, but instead we're going to take the images and the JavaScript and those types of pieces and actually put those into storage and a CDN so that then we can optimize for the dynamic parts of the site. So then we're optimizing for the calls to the backend server, for example. Or we could go ahead and put our full site into Azure Storage or CDN and the like if it's all static in nature. So depending upon where we're starting from and the type of website that we're building determines how far we might go with this pattern. So that does make a point here where this pattern is not potentially very useful. And that is in a scenario where the content is dynamic in nature. So if you think that before you serve the response back to an end user, you need to do something with that response, maybe you need some kind of dynamic calculation or whatnot, or you need to append some information as part of that, that might not be the best scenario for the static content hosting pattern. There are ways that you can inject almost some dynamic approaches, and we'll cover some of that a little bit later as well. But, if it's a dynamic site overall, it may not be the best fit, and it might be something just keeping in the back of your mind, is this the right path for us here? And then, as we just mentioned there, if you are using this pattern alongside a compute platform, so let's say you're hosting your CSS files, your images, your JavaScript files, but the main site itself is still being driven and hosted on some platform like a virtual machine, Kubernetes, app service, something similar. If you're offloading that small amount of static content, is the re-architecture and the need to pull apart those pieces really worth the reward? So what I mean by that is actually changing some of the code base is something that might be necessary there if you need to repoint your static assets, for example, to a different domain, and then you need to start enabling things like CORS, for example, cross-origin resource support. So it's these types of things that you may need to consider. Is it worth that extra overhead in terms of pulling those pieces apart to get that performance gain? And it might be, it might not be, of course, depends how much content you are driving through your website there as well. But again, just bear those thoughts in mind as you go ahead and start evaluating whether this is right for you. So some additional considerations here. Given the fact that we're talking about websites, the static content itself is going to need to be exposed to the public internet. So whether that's through HTTP, whether that's through HTTPS, you'll need to expose that content online in some way there. And because of that, that implies the fact that that content is going to be public. So what happens if you have some content that you don't actually want to be publicly available to end users? Well, there is another cloud design pattern available for that. We're not going to cover it today, but just if you are interested, maybe some homework at a later point for you is to go ahead and use the valet key pattern. And effectively what that is using some kind of access token or a shared access signature so that you can go ahead and access that private content then and not expose it to the public. So, putting it behind some kind of token accessible approach, for example. Think of shared access signatures inside of Azure Storage. That's a good example of the valet key pattern there. Now, let's take stock for a moment, because I keep hinting at this point here that we might be going ahead and putting our entire site into Azure Storage, which is great. It's going to be very cost efficient there from that perspective if we have a static site that is capable of doing that. But when we think of Azure Storage, what we typically think of is IOPS and the number of requests, for example, and transactions that we might be able to handle over a given period of time. But also we might be thinking about, hold on, I, for example, host my storage account in North Europe, but I know that I have end users in Australia, in America, for example, and across the globe from some of the analytics and telemetry that I get from my website. So I want to make sure that those end users don't have a poor experience from a latency perspective as well. So both of those points in terms of protecting the back-end origin or the storage accounts, and also to do with minimizing latency for our end users, can be covered by the CDN aspect of this pattern then as well. So again, we will be covering that because that is something I've adopted for my own architecture for cloudwithchris.com. So we'll go ahead and cover that a little bit here. And then if you are going ahead and using this pattern in combination with those other compute platforms like an AKS, a virtual machine, app service, Azure Spring Boot or Azure Spring Cloud, for example, just think for a moment about that overall deployment lifecycle. So if there's a new version of your website available and it has new static content being released, for example, how do you go ahead and make sure that actually you are pushing the latest and greatest static assets to your CDN and to your static content area? What happens if you need to go and overwrite some of that previously existing content there as well? These are all considerations that you might need to go and make as part of that overall development lifecycle if you are going ahead and still running those two different types of platforms there. But we'll primarily be focusing on having the entire site in a storage account here today, rather than two different platforms. But just bear that in mind if you are going ahead down that route. So with that, that's the context of the static content hosting pattern. So how does it actually go and relate to this thing called Jamstack? Well, Jamstack is effectively a modern way of developing websites. It's actually an abbreviation, and it stands for JavaScript, APIs, and Markup. That's where the jam comes from. It's not like a Paddington Bear kind of reference at all, and the jam sandwiches. It is an abbreviation for JavaScript, APIs, and Markup. So the idea is that rather than going ahead and, having this website where actually you've got a back-end server like a .NET Core or Ruby on Rails or something like that, it's all generated through static files. So JavaScript, CSS, and some kind of markup. And what's very common, as we'll see in a little bit, is having these static site generators where you don't even need to go ahead and render the HTML and the CSS yourself and actually create that and design that, but you'll have a build process to go and generate that on your behalf. Now, there are some interesting patterns to do with these Jamstack kind of websites and these static content hosted websites. The first is which, as I keep implying, that nature of static, we need to go ahead and pre-render the contents of the website. So there needs to be some kind of build process which pre-renders all of our assets ahead of time. And that's where some of these static site generators come into play here. Now, I've kept saying static, 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 but again, there is this element of being able to bring in some dynamic aspects to your static websites. So you can see there the J and the A of Jamstack stand for JavaScript and APIs. So you could feasibly, for example, enhance that experience by using JavaScript, using something like Axios or one of those other tools that are available in the JavaScript world to call your APIs so that you can add some kind of HTTP calls, for example, from your static website and bring in that dynamic nature. And again, I'll show you an example of that here on my cloudwithchris.com website as well. And overall then, we rely on APIs, and I think the modern world that we live in, when we think about microservices and integration and having things like API management, all of this really builds upon this API economy that we see very commonly in the industry these days. So JavaScript, APIs, and markups, Jamstack, you can see how that is starting to relate to this static content hosting pattern here. Now, in terms of the recommended practices when you are building one of these Jamstack sites, there are these number of different principles to go and live by. So the first one is all about putting your entire project on a CDN. And, given that it's static content, that makes complete sense. We now don't have to worry, for example, about any dynamic aspects to our website. So there's no real worry of, having to replicate content, for example, like replicating data or whatnot. Because they're static files and static assets, distributing that across the world is now actually very, very easy. We can just put the CDN in front, it goes ahead, looks at the origin, and then the points of presence across the globe go ahead and pull in that content when a user has requested it. And then we might purge it if we need to go ahead and, force some new content there, for example. But this unlocks this new experience for our end users across the world because they will now be able to access the content from their local point of presence, not some central server that is being hosted, for example. Now, modern build tools, when you think about modern build principles, you probably think about things like Babel, PostCSS, Webpack, and similar. You can take advantage of all of these types of tools by going ahead and, using these modern development approaches effectively to go ahead and chunk up what you're delivering to your end users, and then also using some of these modern principles like PostCSS to go ahead and, again, make that development process of your site and your overall design a little bit easier there for you as well. Now, all of this, if you're reading between the lines, we've got these static files, we've got these assets, for example. That's all well and good. We want to go ahead and keep publishing those to some kind of storage account, for example, maybe, or static website. But we don't want to do that process manually. And when you think of the evolution of DevOps in the industry, we absolutely want to go ahead and have some kind of automated pipeline there to go and do that. So whether that's Azure DevOps, GitHub, GitLab, Jenkins, or similar, for example, go ahead and make sure you've got a pipeline to go ahead and drive that build and release process for your website. Now, atomic deploys, what we're talking about there is the idea of all or nothing. So you might have to feasibly re-update or redeploy hundreds of files by the time you've compiled and pre-built those various static assets that you're looking to deploy there. So you want to go ahead and deploy that effectively as a unit. So there are tools out there that can help you with that, but we'll be looking at how we can do that with Azure Storage and Azure CDN here today. And then again, if you think about the scenario here, and we'll take a look at the Cloud with Chris architecture where this makes sense in a little bit, but you'll want to invalidate that cache instantly as well. If you've got a new version of the website and you've updated a number of content articles, for example, you don't want to go ahead and send your users old information. Instead, you want to make sure that they are being delivered the latest and the greatest content that is available for them. So instant cache invalidation is something which is important, or having a scheme where we can go ahead and make sure our users are receiving the latest and greatest content, whether that's using query strings, for example, is another common approach inside the URL, for example. And ultimately, like most DevOps principles these days for various projects, with this Jamstack approach, everything lives in Git. So all of the content that you're working on, maybe the back-end themes for the website that you're building and generating, that all lives in Git. So then you can go ahead and have this build and release process, which is automated and easily trackable then and deployable to your target environment. So some static site generators that you may recognize. The one that I use for my website is Hugo, but there are others out there. There's things like Jekyll, there's Gatsby, there's ViewPress, and more. I use Hugo just because it was one that I think it was a friend and I were talking about quite some time ago, and it's very performant. It's actually written in Golang, and one of the things that I found since I've been building a few various projects on it is it has a brilliant community which supports it. So actually that's part of the reason why I decided to use Hugo, because it's well documented, it's got a great community who are there to support. So as I'm building up my website and my various themes for other websites that I'm building, I'm going to go ahead and really try and integrate with that community. So a big shout out to the folks there on gohugo.io who are super helpful. So thanks for all of the support there. But again, there's many different options. There's Jekyll, which is built using Ruby, for example. There's Gatsby, there's ViewPress, which uses Vue.js. So you've got many different options depending upon your background there. And these are just a handful of them. There's so many that I wouldn't be able to get them all on a slide. So do take a look and do research yourself there. Now, the architecture for my website is actually fairly simple. There's really three types of components being used: Azure DNS, Azure Storage Accounts, and Azure CDN. Now there is an elephant in the room here, because I mentioned a bit earlier this thing called Azure Static Websites. And Azure Static Websites is a service which I think has been available now for the last year or so, maybe a little bit less than that. And it does a very similar kind of scenario to what you see on screen to what I've built here. The reason I didn't choose it at the time is because it wasn't available at the time for me. So I've effectively built something which is similar to static websites, but I would certainly suggest taking a look at that, because it takes a lot of the manual overhead that we'll see in a moment here away from you and makes it a lot easier to go and deploy and update those websites, including things like your staging environments, your preview environments, etc. as well. Now you can see here on that point that I have a number of environments. I have a preview site, I have a staging site, I have my main production website, and I also have my podcast subdomain as well for anyone streaming my podcast from Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify and the like. Now, all of that, including the streaming of my episodes, those MP3 files there, that entire environment that you see on screen costs me less than £5 a month to actually go and operate and run using Azure. So it's a very, very cost-effective platform, very cost-effective way of architecting. I don't really have any back-end APIs that I'm calling, so I don't need something expensive in terms of compute in comparison to go and run there. I can go ahead and use these kind of static content patterns, excuse me, to have a very cheap and cost-effective way of running my website here. So with that, let's go ahead, stop talking about some of this concepts and this theory now, and let's get hands-on and actually take a look here. So, as you'll see, I have my website here, cloudwithchris.com, and this is my main production website. So as I scroll down, you'll see that I've got a number of different types of content listed here. So various podcast episodes, various vlogs and blogs going on. In here, for example, I render some videos. I've got an inline player, which you can go ahead, click play anywhere. Stuff. And then you can go ahead, look through the blogs and notice how quick all of this content is to serve up here. There's no real lag or latency or anything going on. We could go ahead and see this session live. That would be very meta. We can go and look at guests, for example, that have been on the show here as well. So again, all of this is pre-compiled, pre-built, and then delivered to Azure Storage. And then ultimately, I, as an end user, get this through Azure CDN. The one aspect of dynamic nature that is available on my site is this search bar here. And this is where I'm using JavaScript to go and call effectively some kind of functionality there. And I'm using a JavaScript library to go ahead and perform some searching functionality over a JSON file that is also pre-compiled by Hugo. So if I go ahead and search for GitHub, for example, we'll see all of the content here that is, has either keywords in the title relating to GitHub, whether it is tags, for example, etc., etc. I could go ahead and add gateway there, for example, and you get the idea. I get these additional pieces of content here then as well. So you can see that it's not purely, I only have to have content which has been pre-rendered. We can still use JavaScript and call APIs as well. So this is where you might see things like Azure Functions coming up and having this kind of serverless model to go ahead and host your websites and your platforms there as well. So that is the production website. I also have, if I switch tabs, you probably won't even notice the difference here, a staging site. And the staging site, again, looks exactly the same. That is my kind of pre-production release environment, if you like, of content, just so I can check that everything is okay before I go and release it live and put the latest and greatest on my production version for my end users. And that's an important point, because as soon as I go live with my production website, that automatically updates for me all of my podcast streams, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So making sure I have that quality check on the staging site is important before the go live there. And then I also have a preview site here as well. If I go ahead and refresh this, what we will see here is I can go ahead. I've got effectively this kind of file contents listing, if you like, on my preview subdomain here. I can go ahead, take a look through, go and look at the index.html page and see what the website will look like on this particular environment. Now, you can see actually this video renders a bit strangely. This is because it's a pre-release video. It's not actually live yet. That's coming next Friday. So a sneak peek at some of my upcoming content there as well. But you get the idea. This is all part of my development flow, all being done in an automated fashion using CI/CD, GitHub, Git, and the like as well. So all of those principles that we've been looking through here throughout this talk so far. So from a technology perspective and a service perspective, what is actually going on behind the scenes here? What is happening? So if we go and take a look at my resource groups, I have a number of different resource groups here, and what I'll do is I will show you an example that I made ready for Global Azure here. And I have a couple of storage accounts. So I'm going to go ahead actually and make a brand new storage account for a moment, just so you can see the experience of actually setting this up first. So let's go ahead, search for a storage account here. So we're going to call this CWC GA Live Storage. And we're going to put that in North Europe. And we're just going to make it locally redundant just for this demo purpose. But my main production sites I do actually put in I think it's a read access geo redundant, just so I've got that secondary endpoint if needed. So we're going to go ahead and click through here. We don't need to worry about the connectivity methods. It's going to be a public website, so that's not a problem. We're going to go ahead and not worry about the data protection pieces again, public content, and we're just going to go ahead and click through to the end here. So go click create. And storage accounts are one of the quickest things typically to create in Azure, so it should just take a couple of seconds here for that storage account to be created. And when it's created, what we'll then do is we'll enable a feature called static websites that exists within Azure storage accounts. And it's pretty much just a toggle and then a couple of configuration options. One to point to the index.html file, one to point to the 404 page effectively. So being able to nicely render those pages if we need to there. So there we go. That has now been created, so we can go ahead and take a look here. So on the left hand side, if we just slightly zoom in here, you will see on the left hand side of this blade we have an option for static website. So we go ahead, click on that, we can go click enabled there, and we can go and click on this index document name as well. And we'll just give that index.html as that's going to be what our index page is. And typically what I have for my error path is something like a 404 index.html or something similar like that. I think it can't begin with a slash, so I'll just update that. So we'll go ahead, click save, and that will configure then the static content website aspect of my storage account. But of course, we don't have any content in the storage account yet. So the way that you would go and do that is if you go to your storage account containers, you will now see there is this $web container now available for you in your storage account. This wasn't there when we created a storage account. This gets created when we enable that static website functionality. So as you can see, we have no files in here, and what we would need that CI/CD process to go and do is to go ahead and publish some files into that particular storage account. So we could go ahead, for example, and upload, I don't know, some HTML and CSS files using Storage Explorer. That would absolutely work fine. That is something we could do there. So we're probably not going to do that in the session just because of time constraints, but you know, I'll leave that as a homework exercise if anyone wants to go and do that. But I've got one pre-made and uploaded with content already here. So if we go back to the CWC resource group and we'll go take a look at the prod storage one here. When we look in containers and $web, you can see that I've got a load of folders and files in here, which is effectively the pre-rendered content that I mentioned a bit earlier. So I've got this index.html file here. I don't think I have a 404 page on this one. This is a bit of an older example that I have, but you can get the idea of how this maps to that configuration that we put in a little bit earlier. So if we now go back to this storage account, and if we take a look at properties here, when we look in this properties section now, and we scroll down, we can see there's a section here for static website. We can go ahead, copy that link. We can paste that into our browser. And now you can see that I've got a version of my website on a storage account running there. And as I say, this is an older version of my website, which is running that is a few weeks out of date there. So it kind of checks the boxes, right? It's exposed over HTTP or HTTPS. It's static content. We haven't put a CDN, or we haven't accessed the CDN yet. I have configured it elsewhere. We'll take a look at that in a moment. And all of this is pre-rendered content. ready to go. So this is kind of checking all of the boxes from the Jamstack aspect as well as the static content hosting pattern aspect as well. So let's jump back and take a look then. So we've got the storage account aspect sorted and the static website hosted in there. But as we mentioned earlier, we don't want our end users to go directly to this endpoint because it's hosted in North Europe, so our users in the United States and Australia, for example, will get a poor experience because of the speed of light. That's something I can't change, unfortunately. So we need to try and distribute the content to a location that is closer to them. But also, I want to protect that back-end storage account. I don't want, if I suddenly get a load of followers on my website, I don't want to overwhelm that storage account and start getting throttled on that storage account. I want to protect that back end, that origin. And both of these points are where the Azure CDN can really help us with. So let's jump back to the resource group here and click on our CDN profile. So there are a few different flavors of CDN that you can access, or Azure CDN in particular, I should say. There's offerings from Verizon, there's offerings from Akamai, but the option that I've chosen is the Microsoft standard option. And you can see within this profile, I have a couple of endpoints here just for a couple of demos that I've done. And it's nice and easy to go and create a new endpoint. We can go ahead and say, right, this is my new endpoint. That's going to be the overall URL with the .azureedge.net. And then we just select there the storage static website. So we can go ahead, for example, select that one we looked at a bit earlier, put a subfolder path if we want, but there is no subfolder path for us. It automatically points to the $web folder container for us. And then we can just go ahead, click add, and then that starts populating that CDN endpoint for us. Now it takes a bit of time to get that set up because it needs to kind of bring the content in, start the initial cache off for us, and make sure that those points of presence are available across the globe for us. So that's why I've got some created ready, available already for us here. So if you go ahead, and I'll put this in the chat window here in the comments, just in case anyone is interested, if you go ahead and click on that CWC Global Azure.Azure Edge endpoint, you will notice that you get a very, very snappy experience here. Again, because that content is cached on a point of presence which is local to you. So where I'm based in the UK, I'm going to be getting a point of presence which is close to me. If you're listening in from the United States or Australia or wherever else, then you will be hitting a point of presence close to there, and the content will be getting cached near that point of presence there then. And that is effectively how the model works overall. This is a really simple approach to go and implement here. Now, I just want to make sure that I also showcase some of the CI/CD aspects of this. And I'm not going to do this in a lot of depth because I'm actually delivering another session tomorrow at 1 p.m. UK time. So if you're more interested in the automation aspects of this, come back and tune in once again, because we'll be covering the same kind of concepts, cloudwithchris.com, but really focusing on how I'm using GitHub to automate all of these aspects. But what you'll see in here is I have my theme for my website, I have my content, I even have my podcast audio files in my Git here as well. I actually use Git LFS, large file storage, which is a good pattern for these types of files. And then what I have here is all of my content. So all of my episodes, for example, in the markdown for those there. And that's what eventually gets rendered into these HTML, CSS pages then that you then view as a website. Now what I have is actually a workflow to go and build and release that. And I have a number of different workflows. I have one for my staging environment, one for my preview environment, one for my main production environment then as well, and some other things to help me with automation as well, like releasing those podcast MP3 files, for example. So again, it's all really focused around CI/CD, going ahead, bringing in the right dependencies, going ahead, updating the configuration, and then building the contents, uploading that, and to Azure Storage, and then purging the CDN. So you can see how we're coming full circle with some of these concepts that we've been talking about throughout this session here. But again, if you're interested more so in the automation side of things, definitely tune in again tomorrow at 1 p.m. because I'll be covering that in a lot more depth in tomorrow's session. Now, there is one other thing that I want to go ahead and show before we start wrapping up this particular session here. There is an elephant in the room, and that elephant, as I've mentioned before, is Azure Static Websites. Now, Azure Static Websites, or Static Web Apps as it's commonly known, is a new service, I say new, within the last year or so, which is available and does a lot of what we've talked about there. It doesn't have the CDN built in, but again, it's really simple to go and put a CDN in front of that type of website. And it just makes that experience of going ahead and creating a static web app super, super easy for us. And I want to show you how easy. So if I go ahead, create a new resource, and we just type in static, you can see we've got this Azure Static Web Apps preview here. I can go ahead, click create, and we'll get the normal kind of configuration that we're used to when creating Azure resources. So creating a resource group, creating a new resource name, for example, for the static web app, and then some configuration options. So I'm going to go ahead, just select CWC Global Azure. Going to go ahead and give that a new name. So my new CWC app. Put that in a region, so West Europe, and then we can sign in to some kind of deployment source. And this is the beauty of the static web app service here, is I'm able to go ahead and log into GitHub. What it would then do is it would have a list of my GitHub repositories. I point it to the one that has my static content as a source, and then I go ahead and say, right, okay, this is my repository here that has my Hugo content in, or my it has my my Node content in, or whatever it may be, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and add my password in off screen just to be safe. So there we go, and I have now done that. And what you can see here is I'm now logged in, and we can look at these different organizations. We're obviously going to look at my own. And this is where I can go ahead, pick the particular repository that makes sense, the branch. There we go. We'd go for master. And then you can specify what kind of framework that you're using. So whether it's Angular, whether it's React or Svelte or Vue.js, Blazor, Gatsby, Hugo, VuePress, or something custom as well. So, this is where the power of static web apps really comes in, because what it will then go and do, just to complete the picture, is it will create a workflow file for you in that GitHub repository. So a lot of the manual aspects that I've created in terms of the different preview environments, the actual CI/CD aspects behind all of that drive all of that automation and functionality, are actually just done on my behalf here and created. So it makes that process of getting a static web app set up super, super easy. And if we just go ahead and navigate to one that I made earlier, we can go and see that it's not in there. Where did I put it? I thought I put it in that folder. I put it in a different folder. There we go, in a different resource group. So again, Grey Beach is the name that you would have seen in that workflow file. So if I go and click on that, once again, it looks just exactly like what we saw in the Azure Storage account. And the difference being here, this is being hosted in the Azure Static Web App. So again, it's not coming through the CDN yet. We would need to go and take the steps to go ahead and add this endpoint to our CDN. So we could go ahead and do that nice and easily here. We could go ahead, come back to our CDN, for example. There we go. Static web app like that. Custom origin. Then we go and just add that origin in just like that. And there we go. That is now adding an endpoint for that particular static web app. But as I mentioned, it does a lot of great things for us as well, static web apps, more than what I've implemented on my site actually. And there are a number of great things if I go to the correct resource group here. So for example, think about things like identity. Maybe you're hosting some kind of website that actually you don't want to be publicly accessible to the world. You want to have it behind some kind of authorization. Well, you can go ahead and do that. You can go ahead and come into the configuration here and change some different aspects, etc. But what we care about is this role management aspect. So if we go ahead and click invite, you can see we have a number of different authentication providers we can use, like Azure AD, GitHub, Facebook, Twitter, or Google, and we can go ahead and use that as an option to protect that static website. We can go ahead and have multiple environments. So much like you saw that I have my preview site, my staging site. So my preview site's like feature branches. My staging site is my dev branch. We can go and make something similar to that here. And it's just built into the DNA of static web apps. It's kind of, how it works. We can go and add a custom domain if we like here as well. We can add app insights to it as well. That's something I've added manually on my own. We can go and have specific application settings as well. And the extra benefit, as we mentioned about Jamstack, there may be some backend APIs that we actually want to go and host as well. And this is where we can go ahead and easily extend our static web app by using Azure Functions easily within this kind of deployment model of static web apps here. So again, if you haven't heard of static web apps yet, and you're tuning into this session just to understand about static websites, static content, storage accounts, CDN, etc., definitely check out static web apps, because I think that is a great way to accelerate your journey deploying an Azure static web app. And then, of course, you can put a CDN in front of it as well, as we just saw as an example there. Nice and easily and able to do that. It does take, as I say, a bit of time to go ahead and set up that profile initially, so it might not be already set up yet for us, but let's have a look just in case. So that was called CWC SWA. Let's go ahead to a new tab and just check out if that's created already here. I'll give that a moment. Not yet, not quite yet, but soon enough it should surely get set up there for us there. So overall, what we've taken a look at there is this idea of a static content hosting pattern as a cloud design pattern. We've taken a look at this modern design principle of Jamstack, JavaScript APIs and markup, and being able to use things like static site generators, such as Hugo, to go ahead and easily pre-render and pre-build our site using some kind of DevOps pipeline. And again, if you're interested in the automation side, I have another session coming up tomorrow talking all about the automation side of things. So go ahead and check that one out. And then we've talked about how we use things like the storage accounts, the CDNs, or even static websites and CDNs to go ahead and easily distribute our website then across the globe really easily, giving a great experience to our end users there. So with that, let's go ahead, jump back to the slides deck here and wrap up. So we've covered a lot of ground there, but how do you continue your journey? What are the next steps to keep on learning here? Well, first off, hopefully you already know about it, but if you don't, Microsoft Learn is an incredible resource for you to go and continue your learning with Azure. And it's not just limited to Azure, whether it's Microsoft 365, Dynamics, GitHub even, for example, as well. You can go ahead and use Microsoft Learn to go ahead and build your own learning path effectively. There's plenty of different modules on there. Some of them come together into learning paths. There's even interactive content like Learn TV, which you may have seen linked from the Global Azure website as well. Lots for you to go and experiment with and learn there. And it actually all accumulates as well into some of the certification content. So what you may have noticed is actually some of the certification rules are now being done through Microsoft Learn. And actually some of the content is linked in learning paths that help you towards some of these role certifications. So again, if you're doing this to upskill and learn some new skills to build your knowledge of Azure, doing it from a particular persona perspective, check out Microsoft Learn. That'll be a great resource for you there. Next up then, we have Hugo. So Hugo, you can go and navigate to that at gohugo.io. Brilliant community. Honestly, I've mentioned them once, but I'll mention again. Incredibly welcoming, incredibly friendly, incredibly helpful, where I was going ahead building some of my own custom themes, for example, for local user groups, as well as my own Cloud with Chris theme as well. So go ahead, check out Hugo if that's one of the things, for example, that you're interested in, just experimenting with static site generators. I've had a great experience with Hugo, but of course there are others available out there. But I am a big fan of Hugo and the community that support it. Some great documentation there on getting started as well, quickly and easily. And finally, I must also go and mention my own website, cloudwithchris.com. So I do make a lot of content around things like DevOps, around cloud architecture and these cloud design patterns, as well as things like app dev concepts in Azure as well. So this is just an example of the type of content that you could go ahead and expect. I have lots of guests coming up. I'm actually booked out until September, I believe, at the time of this recording. So we're recording this or live streaming this in April, already booked until September with guests. So plenty of content on the backlog coming up, and some really exciting content and some exciting things on the horizons, dare I say it, with some potential collaborations coming up. So you'll be likely listening to this live or potentially watching back on my YouTube channel, Cloud with Chris. 90% of the people who are listening in are not subscribers, actually. So I am trying to get to a 500 subscriber goal by the end of the year, and I would love your help in doing that. So if you can support, please go ahead, like the video, hit subscribe on the channel and the notification bell so you know as soon as there is new content. But if YouTube isn't your thing, and maybe you're already listening on another format by the time I've rendered this into an MP3 file, but I am also available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify as well. So please go ahead, check out on those platforms as well if you prefer listening there. So with that, cloudwithchris.com, Cloud with Chris either on YouTube or on Facebook, or at RedoBowen on Twitter. If you've got any questions, I'll keep the stream open for a little bit longer here, and we'll interact with those if and as there are any. So all there is to say is thank you very much for tuning in, and thank you for your time. And if there are any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll give it maybe 30 seconds, a minute or so in case there are any. And otherwise, I wish you a very healthy and fortunate day ahead, and we'll say stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you for watching this particular session of Global Azure. And if you have liked it, please do tweet out using hashtag Global Azure, because the Global Azure team had done a brilliant job pulling this virtual conference together in the times that we're in with COVID-19, etc. So with that, I don't see any questions in the chat. So again, thank you for listening in and tuning in here. As I say, stay safe, stay healthy. If you've enjoyed the content, you know what to do. And until the next time, which will be tomorrow, I will be going live at 1 p.m. UK time, talking about how GitHub Actions can help in deploying a podcast or a blog site, as well as building and planning as well. So stay tuned, and hopefully see you tomorrow. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.